Welcome to another episode of OTA on the Air. We have Ed Mortimer with us with the U.S. Chamber, and Ed, thanks for being with us.
Great to be with you, Tom.
All right, thank you again. Thank you again for being with us. Let's talk a little bit about the climate in D.C. Obviously, we have a new administration. A lot of pieces on the chessboard are getting moved around. So talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing out there in regard to what the climate's like.
Sure. So obviously, our country's gone through a very contentious time, but we do have a new administration and a new Congress. And, I think we have a lot of needs in this country that need to be addressed. And we in the chamber and the business community want to work with Democrats and Republicans to come up with some bipartisan solutions. So we're starting off the year. Obviously, the focus right now is on COVID relief, getting through the pandemic, uh, making sure that our transportation networks continue to operate through this challenging time, and getting the vaccines out. Obviously, that's key. Getting the vaccines out, making sure as many Americans get vaccinated as possible so we can all get back to, I hate to use the word normal, but get back to a more traditional operating way, and people can get back to lives. So our goal right now is to focus getting that done. The Senate is taking up a bill as we speak, and hopefully that gets wrapped up by March 14th. And then the focus is really moving to an issue that we have been working with your industry on for a long time, and that's modernizing our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges. American Society of Civil Engineers is coming out with a report card today. And of course, the grade is not good. It's C for bridges, D for roads. Not a surprise to any trucker because you all live and breathe on those roads. But we obviously need to have some action at the federal level to address something that we have been band-aiding for the last 20 years.
Yeah, most definitely, and I think all of our members would agree with you that infrastructure is a key component. And I think one of the things that we always struggle with is all of the ancillary spending that goes on as far as infrastructure goes. I guess talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing when it comes to infrastructure and broadband, and what that impact is going to be, and how that may take away from some of the discussions, obviously with COVID and
Yeah.
everyone transitioning to work from home, and the need for the internet has grown, that we've seen some deficiencies in broadband. I guess, where's that discussion on infrastructure going to lie? Is it going to be, primarily, bridges and roads? Is it going to be, the broadband side? I guess, where do you see that debate really being the primary conversation?
Tom, you bring up a good point. So again, our focus traditionally has been on the traditional transportation networks, because we know that, from a federal component, that having a national freight network is really key to any type of infrastructure legislation at the federal level. That being said, there's a focus from the new administration and members of Congress to address things such as broadband, which again are very important. I think we've all realized through the pandemic that every American needs to have broadband access. We think the private sector has done a great job in putting out broadband around the country. But again, in more rural areas where there wasn't a customer base, we're going to need public private partnerships to address that so that every American has that broadband access. We also have to understand the new administration and Congress is also looking at addressing climate issues. We actually, and I know our partners in the trucking industry embrace this conversation. We want to bring innovation and technology to modernize our infrastructure. So we actually replace infrastructure that was built in the 50s and 60s. So again, modernizing and rebuilding our infrastructure is going to bring us better environmental outcomes. Now, we would rather have that done through incentivizing and allowing the private sector to bring their own innovation and technology. Trucking has been a leader in, improving some of the emissions from trucks, and trying to alleviate some of the bottlenecks around the country. So, look, it's not the traditional surface transportation bill that I know many truckers are used to, but we still see bringing these other things to the table is going to help us get more support and more votes as we solve some of the how do we invest in modernizing this infrastructure.
Right. So talk a little bit about what the current state of affairs is of the Highway Trust Fund. I think a lot of us in the industry have known it's been, one of those funds that has just been underfunded and overused over the years. I guess, where is the current state of it, and how do you see that playing out in the future?
So good question. So the Highway Trust Fund is funded by truckers pay 24.4 cents a gallon in diesel tax. Regular passenger vehicles pay 18.4 cents into a highway trust fund. There's also some other trucking fees that go into this. You have a tire tax, some registration fees. And again, that fund, we haven't raised the revenue sources in that fund since 1993. So unfortunately, since 2008, about one third of all highway funding now is through what we call general fund, which isn't paid for by users of the system. It's just through the government putting money into the fund. We have joined with the trucking industry in saying, look, we need to have sustainable funding sources. So we support adjusting the fuel tax. And then as we move toward electric and other alternative source vehicles, we then, can transition into a vehicle mile traveled, so it won't matter the energy source of the vehicle. But in the short term, the Highway Trust Fund is going to be solvent for the next year. Our concern is, though, that again, we have to go to Congress every year and try to get this general fund money to pay for one third of it. And then again, moving forward, if you want to modernize our networks, we need to have sustainable funding. We need to have predictable federal investment. And again, the trust fund, it seems like every year Congress is battling just to keep the fund afloat. So we think this is the year that we can actually have some transformational legislation that can actually have a vision for that future and that can identify and provide those sustainable funding sources to make sure that state DOTs, local officials know what the federal partner is going to bring. And then we can make some long-term investments that, truckers and others can benefit from for many years to come.
So talk to us, you said that the fuel tax has not been touched since 93. I guess, what do you think is the biggest obstacle in that regard? Is it nomenclature? Is it just because it's called a tax and you've got some folks that have signed the item, I'm not going to raise any taxes pledge, or is it something bigger than that?
I think it's all the things you mentioned, Tom, but the excuse that it can't be done, I just like you guys have done it in Ohio. Kentucky's looking to do it now. 40 states have done it in the last 5 years. And the analysis of the representatives of those local governments who've done it, more like 95% of them get reelected. We're only 90% of folks who vote against paying for more infrastructure. They usually they lose their seats. So, look, the reality is that you're right. Some people have signed a no tax pledge. Look, we in the business community at the chamber normally don't support government taxes. We like to think the private sector can do things on their own. But infrastructure is one of those things that we would like to see government do limited things. The Constitution of the United States calls for the government to do two things. They may have wandered a bit beyond their mandate, but the two things it calls for them to actually do is to defend our country and then interstate commerce. And so we want to see where businesses are willing, and I know the trucking industry, we're willing to pay to see our infrastructure modernized, as long as we know that the money is being used for its intended purpose and that there's a deliverable. The trucking industry has been supporting a lot of those initiatives at the local level. And again, it's easy to support them when you see the projects that are going to get done and there's accountability for getting them done. So we're working to try to get that done at the federal level. We just did an event last week at the Brent Spence Bridge virtually. I don't have to tell anyone in the Ohio Trucking Association about the pain of that bridge and the challenges that brings when there's an accident, or now they're going to be painting, which is going to shut down 2 lanes for 6 months. 3% of our nation's gross domestic product goes over the bridge. That's unacceptable. We got to fix the bridge. We got to modernize it, and we got to do it now. We can't keep waiting. Kicking the can down the road is only going to cost the trucking industry and Americans. We're going to lose productivity. We're going to impact our quality of life. And we all feel it at the shelves because our products are going to cost more because of the cost associated with increased logistics cost.
Yeah, I had a former Ohio member of Congress tell me one time that if it was called a gas gas fee or a highway fee or something other than gas tax, they'd have raised it 10 times by now, but just because of the tax, the tax label on it it's been a challenge out there. So it's always interesting to hear those discussions play out. So I guess talk a little bit about what the U.S. Chamber's priorities are going to be when it comes to infrastructure and the bill as it's proposed.
Sure. So, the U.S. Chamber has been working with the trucking industry for the last several years on infrastructure modernization. We were hopeful that we could get some action in the last administration. While we continue to get a record amount of funding, we didn't get that big bill done. And so one of the initiatives we're taking up this year is to try to broaden the constituency base. Of course, business, the trucking industry are going to be supportive of infrastructure investment, but we've reached out to groups such as the environmental community, the clean energy community. And so we started a new initiative called Build by July 4th. Again, aggressive timeline, asking for Congress to act by July 4th. Again, we've been kicking this can down the road the last several years. And so we're trying to bring in some of the non-traditional folks that, I know truckers get scared because they're like, we just need roads and bridges. But again, we need to get the support in Congress. And so we may have to add some things that the trucking industry isn't used to having as part of infrastructure debate. But again, we got to get the job done. And so we're reaching out to these non-traditional folks to lean into these new members of Congress, new administration, who say they want to do infrastructure. We have to hold their feet to the fire, and we can't just accept press releases and statements and hearings. We need to get a bill to the president's desk that he signs into law, and so that we actually start building, and we actually start seeing the benefits of modern infrastructure. Again, I mentioned the cost of the economy. Truckers know this oh too well. Sometimes you miss your hours of service, you got to pull over because you got stuck in congestion. We can do better as a nation. We have done better in the past. We had Dwight Eisenhower develop the interstate highway system. Ronald Reagan supported adjusting, and we were getting back to our previous conversation. Sometimes we call it a user fee. Folks in Washington don't get that. You can call it whatever you want to call it, but we need to invest to modernize our infrastructure. And we in the business community are willing to work with trucking and the other stakeholders to come up with some common sense solutions to actually get some benefits. We can't just keep kicking the can down the road because eventually all of us are going to pay for this. It's a question of when do we start paying, and the longer we wait, it's going to cost all of us more money to actually make these investments.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up Ronald Reagan, and I remember we were in a Call on Washington event, and we were in at the time Speaker Boehner's office, and there was this big, huge picture of Ronald Reagan in there, and I remember saying to his aide, I'm like, we need some courage, to lead, and I pointed up the picture of Ronald Reagan. And I said he raised the gas tax twice during his administration, so yeah, it's definitely time to reinvest and do that. So, we kind of got off on that a little bit. The past highway bills that you and I have been a part of, they spend an inordinate amount of time on policy stuff and doing that side of it, but very little time talking about the pay fors. Like, how is this, how is the financing of this going to actually work? I guess, what do you see as that reality of, what the pay fors are going to look like, and how it gets done?
So the reality is it's not going to be just one. We're going to have a variety of ways to fund and finance. So we need to increase public investment. And again, we've talked about the fuel tax. We're also open to things, transitioning to a VMT. But again, that's a more longer term effort at the national level. We're involved in, and I know trucking industry is involved in some of the pilots locally, but we need to have how do we transition? What's that arc to get us from the fuel tax to the VMT? We think it's about 10 years. So we got to have in this legislation that blueprint to get us there. Look, we also need to support private investment where it makes sense. So utilizing things such as private activity bonds, leveraging, interest rates are really low. Can we borrow to make some of these investments and pay it back like you would your mortgage? So again, we're going to look at a variety of options. I will caution here, though, and I know trucking industry is very sensitive to this. While we support private investment, it doesn't replace. It's not a replacement. It supplements core public investment. So we're not just going to have private investment make up a large chunk. It's going to play a small, but maybe in certain parts of the country, a significant part of addressing projects that may not have gotten done through the regular process. So, at the end of the day, Tom, I think we're going to see about 5, 6, 7 things that are going to be part of this options thing. And our view at the chamber's always been is let's provide project sponsors the largest toolkit of funding and financing options, and then let them pick the ones. I mentioned the Brent Spence Bridge earlier. I know on the Ohio side they're much more open to a toll. The Kentucky side is not. I know tolling is a difficult issue in the trucking industry, but maybe there's a solution where there's a minimal toll, but we can supplement that with some state and federal investment to keep the toll down to a manageable level. So coming up with those kind of compromised common sense solutions, that's how we're going to address these problems. Just staying in our corners and saying, if I don't get what I want, I'm not going to do it. That's not solving the problem, and it actually exacerbates, and it's going to end up making the cost even more. So we look forward to working with Republicans, Democrats, the administration to finally come up with some options that can get enacted into law. And again, it won't make everybody happy, but again, the doing nothing, the cost of inaction actually costs more than the cost of action.
Yeah, without question. I mean, that's just construction inflation on its own merit will, just makes it,
Mhm,
those costs go through the roof year over year over
mhm,
year. And that's when I
mhm.
first started here at the Ohio Trucking Association, the cost of the Brent Spence Bridge was in the $3 billion range. Now it's at 5, 6.
Yep.
And you're right. I mean, the ability and the flexibility to manage our money and use our money effectively needs to be done. The same as your members and my members running their business have
Mhm,
that opportunity available to them.
mhm.
Brent Spence is not going to get built and rebuilt off of a fuel tax or a VMT or anything like
Right.
that. It's just too
Mhm,
monumental of a project to be able to
mhm.
get that done. That there needs to be some outside investment to be able to get that done, and whether that results in a toll or not is it still needs to be determined. But I think that
Mhm,
there's some creative financing that can be done to definitely get that done.
mhm,
So let's talk a little bit about our new Secretary of Transportation
mhm.
and what your initial thoughts are on some of the proposals that he has laid out.
Sure. So, Secretary Buttigieg is a Midwesterner, comes from South Bend, Indiana. Um, he did some transportation while he was mayor there, smart streets. He's come to the job with, I will say, he is the hippest Secretary of Transportation we've ever had. You might see him on the late night show. He has more Twitter followers than any previous secretary. He's, only 40 years old. So he kind of brings in that millennial, younger person idea. And we view him as someone who we can work with in the sense that he's been accessible. He's willing to listen. But look, I mean, he's bringing an agenda that is different than what some of us have dealt with in the past. He certainly wants to address the climate issues, some of the equity issues, which we in the chamber support. That some of the infrastructure we built in the past disadvantaged some lower and unserved communities, and as we modernize it, we can make sure that every single American benefits from modern infrastructure. I think that's a win for everybody. Um, we haven't seen him lay out a whole lot of policy provisions. His focus to date has been to work with the administration on COVID relief. Has been very active with the aviation industry, keeping them moving. Been supportive of helping the trucking industry get the vaccine out. So I think I would say it's early. Um, we are optimistic. He's off to a good start. But we have to see what happens. Once we're through this COVID relief bill, which I mentioned should be done by March 14th, we're really going to dive into infrastructure. And, it's really going to take, we expect him to be an important player in articulating the views of getting something done. Since he's young, he actually wants to get things done. And so we're walking in with an open mind and willingness to sit down and have these conversations. So I think I would say the initial start has been positive, but we still have a ways to go, and look forward to coming back to talking to you a few months from now, and I might be able to give you a better read on where we see the new secretary going.
Well, yeah, you bring up a great point. I mean, it's probably the most high-profile DOT secretary that we've ever had. To
Mhm,
talk about somebody who was a close competitor of the president in the primary, and somebody who has a great deal of support from his constituency and his followers. I guess
mhm,
what does that signal for you
mhm.
when you talk about the new administration and their emphasis on infrastructure and getting something done? Is that something that you're seeing as the president's top priority or one of their top priorities post COVID relief as an area of focus?
Tom, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think after we get through COVID relief, uh, we see that the president has said it's going to be a top priority. Just to give you an example, uh, tomorrow, President Biden is going to be meeting with Republicans and Democrats on the House to talk infrastructure. Last week, he talked with a bipartisan group of senators, and Secretary Buttigieg has been involved in all those meetings. So the administration and the secretary have been working hand in hand in working on a bipartisan basis to listen and to, as they're formulating their proposals, they've been listening to both Republicans and Democrats. And we believe at the end of the day, if we're going to get something signed into law, it's going to take some bipartisan solutions to get it done. We are seeing the COVID relief bill use a mechanism called budget reconciliation, which only requires the Democratic Party to vote for it. Our view is infrastructure should not go that way, that it's always been bipartisan. There's an old saying, there is no Republican road or Democrat bridge. We're all Americans. And so we're hopeful and optimistic that the administration will work on a bipartisan basis to move forward on infrastructure. And again, we're not all going to like every piece of parts of these bills, but again, the cost of inaction is costing us more than the cost of action. So we want to be a constructive partner in that discussion. We're optimistic with these meetings that the president and the secretary have already had with Republicans and Democrats. We just got to keep our foot on them and make sure that they actually get it done. Too many times we've had some false starts. One reason or another, it didn't happen. This is the year we can't let them walk away and say, we can't do it, it's too difficult, blame the other side. We in the business community, trucking industry, we have to stand behind our elected officials and say, look, you've got to make some solutions here. Don't tell us why you can't get it done. Tell us how you're going to be part of the solution to get it done.
So let's talk a little bit about vehicle miles traveled, since that has been, one of the key things that the secretary's talked about very heavily. In fact, I think he was on the annual meeting of AASHTO this week and even talked about it. I guess what do you see that reality being? How do you see that playing out? Is it a pilot project initially? Is it something that they slap on one sector of the transportation network over another? I guess, how do you see, or what's the discussions about how that gets played out?
Sure, Tom. And as I said earlier, we see VMT as the future. We don't see it as something we can do at the federal level now. As I mentioned, we have some pilot programs going on in about 7 states. I know we've been involved in some, the trucking industry is involved in some. There's some technology, there's some privacy, things that need to get worked out. But it needs to be part of the solution as we arc toward the future. And again, we view this infrastructure bill as what's the blueprint for the future? We can't just do a status quo bill where we just fill the pothole. We need to have, knowing that autonomous trucks, even drones are coming on, we need to have an infrastructure that's able to address that. So in the short term, we think there needs to be a national pilot program. The chairman of the House Transportation Committee, Peter DeFazio of Oregon, has come out and supported that. It will be in the House bill. We think the Senate will embrace that as well. But we also need to have more than just a pilot program. We need to have, what's that arc, to get us there. I think trucking can play an important role in that. You all already have the electronic logging devices. So there's some built-in infrastructure within the trucking industry that makes you all open to it. And I think we're open to having trucking being a partner in that. I only caution that we can't just have trucking pay for all this new infrastructure. This is a shared responsibility between all the users of the system. And so, we need to make sure that is part of the discussion as well. But VMT is going to play an important role. But again, it's not the solution. There's some elected officials that are saying, oh, well, let's just do a VMT and be done with this. Not that simple. It's going to take some time, but we need to have that arc, that transition period for how we get from today to now, starting with the national pilot and then making sure we're making the investments so as we move forward, that we are ready and able to implement that. But again, we got 273 million vehicles in the current fleet today. It's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of education to the American public. So we think we see the opportunity there, but we're cautioning that in the short term, we still believe adjusting that fuel tax one more time and then transitioning out is really the way to go in the short term.
So what do you, when you talk about VMT pieces, how do you address the issue of like fuel surcharges that the industry
Mhm,
has been as a standard of that to be able
mhm.
to offset the fluctuation in gas prices? What the impact of VMT will be on that, because now it'll go to a fixed cost of the trucking company.
Right.
What has been some of the conversations you've had surrounding that?
Yeah. So again, a lot of these things need to get worked out. So, how do you charge rural versus urban? Obviously, you could argue the cost of urban travel is more expensive than in rural areas. So how do you differentiate the two? You talk about the fuel surcharges. So how do we work on that with shippers and through the bill of lading? How is that delineated? What is the true cost to the trucking industry? And many of those costs are the federal government is even aware of, such as the fuel surcharge. Again, we need to have practical people, operations people sit down with our elected leaders and walk them through this. I can tell you those conversations are well underway. We don't have the solutions yet, but I think there is a willingness. Trucking is a constructive partner in these conversations. We in the business community want to be a constructive partner, but we got to work these things out. And again, as I mentioned, it's going to take some time. Again, and just looking at what's happened to trucking over the last couple of years, we really are moving toward a much faster paced e-commerce environment. So everything's happening at a much faster pace, and trying to incorporate all that in these changes, it's going to take some time. It's going to take some patience. And so, I urge, your members to, be part of that conversation and understand that we understand the difficult job that the men and women of Ohio Trucking are doing. And it's going to take some time to get us there, but we have to have this conversation and we have to figure this out. We can't just keep kicking the can down the road. So, in the short term, Tom, we got to work with these things out. But we need to all be willing to come to the table and have a constructive conversation. We're optimistic that at the end of the day, we're going to get these worked out in the long term. And we got to have that blueprint and showing some steps along the way so we can work out some of the issues that you mentioned with fuel surcharge and many other issues with the trucking industry as we move forward in this area.
Great. Well, Ed, thank you so much for joining us on OTA on the air for this episode. And thank you for what you are doing and what the U.S. Chamber is doing out in D.C. on behalf of not only the trucking industry, but all businesses as well.
Great to be with you. Hope everyone stays safe and healthy and keep trucking.